A passenger poured hot tea on a baby's blanket, but the teen's clever response turned the situation upside down. A passenger poured hot tea on the baby's blanket, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the teen was ready to make him taste the tray table in response. The moment the scalding liquid spilled, the cabin's balance of power flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The Silver Meridian lurched as Ethan Morrell stepped into the carriage, the sudden jolt nearly knocking the breath from his chest. He tightened his grip on the small carrier strapped against him, instinctively angling his body so the movement of the train hit him first and not the infant inside. Leo slept on, unaware, his tiny face half hidden beneath a blue blanket that still carried the faint, sterile scent of the hospital. The doors slid shut behind them with a hollow clang, sealing Ethan into the night-bound train and the responsibility he could not set down. He moved quickly down the narrow aisle, boots brushing against scuffed flooring, eyes scanning for a place that offered the least exposure. The carriage was already full, men slumped in their seats with loosened ties, tired shoulders and expressions dulled by long hours of work. Metal trays rattled somewhere behind him, and the low murmur of conversation blended with the steady grind of wheels against track. Ethan chose a corner seat without hesitation, sliding into it and positioning himself between the aisle and the carrier. His shoulders squared, posture deliberate. If anything happened, it would reach him before it reached Leo. Only then did he notice the man across from him. Marcus Hale sat with one ankle crossed over the other knee, polished shoes catching the overhead light. His coat was neatly pressed, his jaw tight, his gaze sharp and unwelcoming. The moment Ethan settled, Marcus's eyes flicked to the carrier. They lingered there a second too long. A crease formed between his brows, and his lips pressed together as if suppressing a complaint that had not yet been voiced. Ethan felt it immediately. The tension, thin and stretched, like wire pulled too tight. He lowered his eyes, focusing instead on the carrier straps, checking them by touch alone. He had memorized every rule posted at the station, every stop between here and North Vale. Stay quiet. Don't draw attention. Get off the train, hand Leo to their aunt, and let this night end. That was the plan. Plans, he reminded himself, only worked if you guarded them. The train surged forward, lights flickering briefly before stabilizing. Outside the windows, darkness swallowed the platform, replaced by streaks of rain and blurred reflections of the carriage interior. The movement made the baby shift. Leo stirred, a soft sound escaping him, barely more than a breath. Ethan reacted instantly, rocking the carrier with slow, controlled movements, murmuring under his breath, "It's okay. I've got you." His voice was low, careful, shaped by weeks of late nights and whispered reassurances. Across from him, Marcus exhaled sharply. It was not loud, but it was deliberate. His fingers tapped once against the armrest, then stopped. His eyes lifted again, irritation now openly etched across his face. Ethan didn't look back. He kept his focus on Leo, on the rise and fall beneath the blanket, on the fragile calm he was trying to preserve. Every sound felt amplified, the click of a tray latch, the squeak of the carriage door, the faint drip of rain against glass. Ethan's pulse matched the rhythm of the tracks. He had the unsettling sense of being watched, of a moment forming just beyond his control. He told himself it was nothing, that fatigue was playing tricks on him. Still, his shoulders remained tense, his body angled protectively forward. The night pressed in around them as the train cut through the darkness, carrying them farther from the station and closer to something Ethan could not yet name. He kept rocking the carrier, steady and patient, even as unease settled deep in his chest. He believed, desperately, that vigilance could keep fate at bay. Some journeys test you not by distance, but by how much you are willing to endure. The cup tipped forward. There was no warning, no time for words, only the sharp, sickening splash of hot liquid meeting fabric. A hiss of steam rose instantly, curling in the stale air like smoke. The tea soaked the soft blue blanket with ruthless speed, seeping through folds and threading toward the baby's skin. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. In one motion, instinct faster than thought, he lunged, pulling the carrier tight against his chest. Leo shrieked. The baby's cry was high-pitched and panicked, cutting through the hum of the train like a siren. The quiet carriage, once filled only with low conversation and the clatter of metal wheels over tracks, turned abruptly tense. Heads lifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the swaying light fixtures seemed to pause in their gentle flicker. Marcus Hale jerked upright in his seat, lips curled in annoyance rather than concern. "For heaven's sake," he muttered, dabbing at his trousers with a napkin, more irritated by the mess on his clothes than the consequence of the spill. Ethan's hands trembled as he tore away the soaked blanket. The fabric clung to Leo's onesie, hot but, thank God, not scalding. Beneath, the baby's skin was red only from fright, not burns. Relief hit Ethan like a crash, but the panic didn't vanish. It morphed into something harder, sharper, colder. Nolan Pierce, the young attendant who had served the tea, stood frozen 2 steps down the aisle, his hand still on the refreshment cart. His face had gone pale. "Oh, no," he whispered. I told him it was hot," I said. Ethan didn't raise his voice. "You warned him." "I did. I swear I did." The train rocked gently over a bend in the track, the lights above casting long shadows down the aisle. The scent of steeped tea hung heavy in the air, mixed with something sterile and wrong, like hospital antiseptic remembered too vividly. Leo kept crying, twisting in his carrier, fists clenched. Ethan stroked his head, whispering softly, steadying his own heartbeat through his voice. "You're okay, Leo. You're okay. I've got you." "Control your child," Marcus snapped, flicking tea off his sleeve. "Some of us are trying to travel in peace." Ethan looked up slowly. His eyes met Marcus's. "You spilled scalding tea on a baby," he said, his voice low and firm. "You were told it was hot." Marcus lifted a brow, smug behind his polished veneer. "I barely touched it. The train jolted. If anything, blame the tracks." "You pushed the cup." "I moved my elbow," Marcus countered. "It was an accident. These things happen. Perhaps babies don't belong on night trains." The sentence landed like a slap. Ethan's jaw tightened. His chest burned, not with the tea, but with something that had been simmering since the first moment Marcus glared at Leo. Not just inconvenience, disdain. Other passengers were watching now, some openly. A man with paint-stained overalls leaned slightly in his seat. A teenager near the back slid out one earbud. Eyes tracked between the baby's cries and the tea puddle spreading across the tray table and Ethan's lap. Ethan adjusted Leo's carrier, shielding him tighter, then turned again to Nolan. "Can I get some towels?" he asked calmly, though the anger sat beneath every word like a clenched fist behind glass. Yes, of course," Nolan stammered. "I'll be right back." He practically ran down the aisle, cartwheels squeaking behind him. Ethan wiped Leo's face gently with the sleeve of his jacket, then turned his attention to the mess. His own jeans were damp now. A small sting kissed the skin beneath, but nothing compared to what it could have been. Still, every second felt like a tremor in control. His original goal, get to North Vale without incident, was collapsing in real time. Marcus shifted again, pretending to adjust his jacket, then leaned back with a theatrical sigh. "I should file a complaint," Marcus muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "This entire section has become a nursery." From down the aisle came the sharp click of polished shoes. The train conductor appeared, Harold Venn, a tall, lean man in a Navy uniform with lines on his face etched deep from years of authority. His gaze scanned the scene like a judge arriving late to a courtroom. "What's going on here?" Marcus straightened immediately. "Finally, I've been trying to enjoy my journey, but this boy's child," he gestured dismissively toward Ethan and Leo, "has been screaming and now managed to cause a mess all over my seat." Ethan didn't move. He didn't cause anything. Your tea spilled when you elbowed the cup. The conductor's eyes narrowed. He looked from Marcus to Ethan to the puddle, then down at the crying baby. Anyone hurt? Ethan shook his head once. The blanket got it the worst, but the tea was hot. This could have gone a lot worse. I warned him, Nolan said quietly, returning with a wad of paper towels in his hands. I told him the cup was full and the train might jolt. That's not true, Marcus snapped. You mumbled something and shoved it down like I was some child. Nolan flinched. Ethan stood slowly, Leo in one arm, the ruined blanket dripping onto the floor in the other. You never looked at the cup, he said. You looked at us. Marcus laughed dryly, a forced chuckle with no humor behind it. Oh, please, don't dramatize this. It's a minor inconvenience at best. Ethan met the conductor's gaze. If I hadn't pulled him back, my brother would be in a hospital again right now. The silence was heavier now. Conductor Venn rubbed his temple, clearly weary. Let's all take a breath. I'll need statements when we stop at North Vale. Until then, keep calm. He turned and walked on, leaving a fragile order behind him. Marcus leaned back, folded his arms, and muttered, Babies don't belong on night trains. Ethan sat down slowly, but something inside him didn't settle. Not this time. He took out his phone. His hands still shook, but he found the voice recorder app, slid his thumb over the screen, and pressed record. He placed the phone on the edge of his seat, camera down, screen dark. The tea stain on the tray table had started to dry at the edges, but the center was still slick and steaming. He didn't say a word, but he wouldn't forget, and he wouldn't let anyone else forget either. In a single careless second, silence can turn into a battle that cannot be undone. The hiss of steam rose like a threat. Ethan's heart surged into his throat as he lunged forward, snatching the baby carrier away from the table. The cup lay sideways, its contents spreading across the tray and dripping down the edge onto the floor. The blue blanket was drenched, darkened, and steaming faintly. Leo's cry came next, a piercing, startled wail that seemed to cut through the entire carriage. The sound didn't just announce pain. It declared fear, confusion, and fragility all at once. Ethan dropped into the seat again, already pulling the blanket back with trembling fingers. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly fumbled the snaps on the carrier's side. He peeled away the damp fabric layer by layer until he reached Leo's undershirt. Dry, warm, untouched. The baby's skin, soft and impossibly new, was red only from the effort of crying, not from burns. Thank God, no burns. Ethan released a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief swept over him, but only for a second. Then came the anger. It wasn't loud or explosive. It arrived slowly, like heat rising through a room. Ethan's jaw tightened. His back straightened. His breath evened out not from calm, but from control. He looked up, right into the face of Marcus Hale. Marcus sat with arms folded, legs still crossed, and an expression of detached inconvenience on his face. He didn't look sorry. He didn't even look mildly concerned. He looked annoyed. I did warn you, Nolan's voice came in, tight with guilt as he stepped back toward the aisle. I told him it was hot. I said it could spill if— Enough, Marcus snapped, waving a dismissive hand toward the young attendant. It's not my fault the train jolted. The boy should have known better than to bring an infant into a packed public carriage. This isn't a nursery. The words landed like slaps. Ethan rose from his seat slowly, the baby still cradled in one arm. His voice, when it came, was low and even. Why didn't you secure the cup? Marcus blinked at him, incredulous. Excuse me? You knew it was hot. You were told. You saw how unstable the table was. You saw how close it was to us, and you left it on the edge. Marcus laughed once, cold and sharp. You're blaming me? For the train's movement? For your decision to bring a baby on board without taking proper precautions? Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the spare burp cloth hanging from the diaper bag and began dabbing at the carrier. His movements were mechanical, but his thoughts were racing. The spill hadn't just been a careless mistake, it had felt like something else. A calculated provocation. A test. One that Marcus had expected him to fail with noise, panic, or rage. But Ethan remembered something. His father's voice in his mind, steady and firm. Control your timing. You don't win by shouting louder, you win by lasting longer. The carriage buzzed softly with murmurs. No one was intervening. No one was defending either side. Most passengers had already decided to pretend nothing happened. A few eyes watched nervously, flicking between Ethan and Marcus like they were waiting for a storm to break. "Do you have towels?" Ethan asked, turning to Nolan. The young attendant looked relieved to have something to do. Yes, I'll get some right away." Marcus huffed and leaned back in his seat, muttering, "Ridiculous." At that moment, a new figure appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in an air of responsibility. The train conductor, Harold Venn, approached with a firm step and a clipboard tucked under his arm. "What's going on here?" His voice was rough and no-nonsense, clearly used to enforcing order in tense spaces. Before Ethan could speak, Marcus beat him to it. "There was a spill," Marcus said, gesturing dismissively. "The train jolted. Tea went everywhere. The child is fine, no need for drama. But now this young man is trying to assign blame where there is none. I've had a long day, and I'd appreciate some peace." Ethan stared at him. The lie was smooth, polished. It wasn't just inaccurate, it was strategic. A setup. One that painted Marcus as the polite commuter being harassed by an overly sensitive teen. Venn turned to Ethan. "Is that true?" Ethan's voice was calm, but his mind was already pivoting to the only tool he had left. The cup was placed too close to the edge of the tray. Nolan warned him. The train rocked, but Marcus had his elbow out, and it pushed the cup. After the spill, he said this wasn't a place for babies. Marcus scoffed again. "You see, he's exaggerating everything." "I have it recorded," Ethan said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Not the spill itself, but the conversation after, just in case there's confusion later." That stopped everything. Marcus's mouth froze mid-retort. Nolan, who had returned with a handful of the paper towels, paused in place. Even Venn shifted, visibly uncertain. "You recorded it?" the conductor asked, tone wary. "I started after the spill," Ethan said, "when I realized no one would believe me otherwise." There was a pause, and in that pause, the shape of the narrative began to shift. Ethan saw it, saw the unease creeping into Marcus's face, saw the change in how Venn was now assessing the scene. But the damage had been done, not just to the blanket, but to the moment. The opportunity to act calmly had passed, and now they were deep in the maze of perspective and position. And Ethan understood something else. If he had shouted, Marcus would have won. If he had broken down, Marcus would have walked away with sympathy. But by choosing stillness, by documenting instead of lashing out, he had changed the terrain. He kept wiping the carrier, his motions quiet, deliberate. A towel soaked through. A hush fell over the seats again. Marcus said nothing now, his silence louder than before. Ethan finally sat down again, holding Leo close. The baby whimpered against his chest, but his eyes had begun to droop again. The moment had exhausted him. The train rumbled on, the lights overhead flickering just slightly as they entered a tunnel. Reflections danced across the windows. Ethan saw his own face there, young, tired, but no longer scared. This wasn't over, but it had changed, and it would not go back. When the powerful speak first, truth must learn how to wait. Marcus Hale's voice was already slicing through the tension like a blade. "As I said, it was an unfortunate accident," he declared, his tone smooth but thinly veiled with disdain. "The train jolted. I hardly touched the cup. It's regrettable, of course, but these things happen when one brings infants onto public transport." The words hung in the air like a stale scent. Conductor Harold Venn stood with his notepad open, pen twitching in his calloused hand, jaw tight with irritation. His posture gave away his real desire to end the matter quickly and move on. Ethan Morrell didn't flinch. His heart was thudding, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "The tea was already dangerously full," he said, his gaze locked on Venn but flicking once to Marcus. "Nolan warned him it was hot. I was watching." His elbow moved. He wasn't watching the cup. He was watching us. "Are you accusing me of intentional harm?" Marcus interrupted, brows arching high. "I'm describing what happened," Ethan replied calmly, "and what almost happened to my brother." The train rocked again beneath their feet. Ethan instinctively adjusted the baby carrier on his lap, shielding it with one arm. Leo whimpered softly, sensing the unrest around him. Nolan Pierce stood nearby, eyes darting between them. His hands were clenched near the service cart, guilt and anxiety pooling in the tight line of his shoulders. I did warn him," he added hesitantly. "I even said the train was hitting uneven rails. I mean, I didn't think it would," Marcus scoffed, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "It's not my fault if the train shakes like a carnival ride." Venn raised a hand, exhaling through his nose. "All right, we'll address this properly at the next station. North Vale. Both of you will speak to the supervisor there." Ethan's breath caught. That was too far away. That was too much time for truth to be twisted beyond recognition. He scanned the tray table between them, the stained cup still resting crookedly, the dark blotch of tea like a wound across the surface. Beside it, the service cart still held a second cup, steam rising lazily from untouched hot water. Marcus leaned back, fingers tapping against his armrest. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "You're letting a child play judge." Ethan's eyes sharpened. A thought formed, clean, clear, and controlled. He rose slightly from his seat and spoke. "Do you really believe the tea wasn't dangerous?" he asked, voice even. Marcus smirked. "Obviously. It's warm water. Nothing more." "Then show us," Ethan said. A pause. The silence in the carriage tightened. Marcus chuckled dismissively. "I don't need to prove anything to you." But Ethan had already moved. He stepped forward, not with aggression, but with purpose. In one fluid motion he reached for Marcus's wrist. It wasn't a grab, it was a demonstration. Ethan pressed Marcus's palm flat against the metal tray table, still warm from the spill, still marked by the aftermath. It lasted barely 2 seconds. A hiss escaped Marcus's throat as his hand met the heated surface. He jerked away violently, eyes wide with shock. "What do you think you're doing?" The carriage went dead silent. Ethan stepped back immediately, hands up in clear view. "You said it wasn't dangerous," he said simply. His voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "Now you know what my brother felt," through a blanket. A ripple passed through the passengers. No one spoke, but every pair of eyes was suddenly awake, watching, understanding. Nolan's jaw had dropped slightly. He looked at Ethan as if seeing something new. Conductor Venn's expression darkened, more from shock than clarity. "That was completely unacceptable," he barked. "You've crossed a line, boy." "I know," Ethan answered, "but now we're all on the same side of it." Marcus was cradling his hand, more in pride than pain. His face had turned red, not from the heat, but from humiliation. "He assaulted me. That was assault." "Was it?" Ethan asked. "Or did I just show you what you called harmless?" Venn didn't respond immediately. He was caught between authority and reason, between protocol and the raw weight of what he'd just witnessed. The hum of the train continued. The wheels didn't care who was right, but the people did, and now they'd seen something they couldn't unsee. In that moment, Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt exposed. He had taken a risk, not of violence, but of clarity. It might cost him. He might regret it, but he had done it for a reason. Leo stirred again. Ethan bent down, checking the baby's face, gently tucking the damp edges of the blanket away from his cheeks. His movements were tender, unaffected by the storm he had just triggered. Marcus remained frozen, speechless for once. Ven shook his head slowly, pulling his radio from his belt. "I'll be requesting security to meet us at North Vale," he said. "You three will exit the train together." Nobody objected. The train rocked on. The passengers leaned away or leaned closer, depending on what they believed. But nobody looked away. And Marcus didn't touch another cup. Sometimes understanding arrives only when comfort is taken away. Marcus Hale's voice rose above the carriage, sharp and outraged. "He assaulted me. I want him detained immediately." The words struck the air like a stone through glass. Chatter exploded in every direction. Passengers leaned out of their seats, some gasping, others muttering disbelief. The atmosphere twisted, thick with judgment and curiosity, as eyes darted between Marcus's reddened face and Ethan's steady posture. Ethan didn't move. He stood beside the baby carrier, one hand lightly resting on the edge, the other still hovering near his side, open, visible, calm. "He grabbed my hand," Marcus said louder now, pressing his palm against his jacket. "Pressed it against a burning tray. That is assault." But the trembling edge in his voice betrayed the fury he was trying to weaponize. He looked not at the conductor or the passengers, but at the camera phones beginning to quietly tilt in his direction. Some passengers were filming now, discreet, half hidden in coat sleeves and behind seat backs. The narrative was no longer his to dictate. Conductor Harold Ven stepped back into the aisle, his radio already crackling. His eyes swept from the steaming tray table to Marcus's face, then to Ethan's upright figure. He raised the device to his mouth. "We'll need security assistance at North Vale Station," he said flatly. "Passenger disturbance, multiple witnesses, possible minor altercation. No medical emergency." Ethan didn't flinch. Nolan Pierce stood off to the side, gripping the metal cart, his hands pale against the frame. He looked back and forth between the two men like someone caught between duty and consequence. He opened his mouth twice but said nothing. Marcus noticed and pointed at him. "You saw what he did, didn't you? Tell him." But Nolan hesitated. I saw you mock him. After the spill. I warned you the tea was hot. You brushed it off." Marcus scoffed, arms flaring in exasperation. "You're a tea boy. Your warnings mean nothing." The words slipped out too fast, too unfiltered, and the air shifted. A man in the back muttered, "That's low," and another nodded silently beside him. Ethan crouched, gently checking on Leo, who whimpered but was otherwise quiet. The baby's new covering, a plain gray shirt from Ethan's backpack, was wrapped snugly. Ethan ran a finger along Leo's cheek, soft and warm. A flicker of relief. Then he stood again, eyes locking briefly with Marcus. Cheek, soft and warm. A flicker of relief. Then he stood again, eyes locking briefly with Marcus. "I didn't want any of this," Ethan said, voice quiet but audible. "But I'm not letting my brother get hurt. Not by your carelessness, and not by your pride." Marcus laughed bitterly, though the sound faltered halfway. "You think that was carelessness? You think I meant to do that?" Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The implication hung heavier now that more passengers had watched how Marcus handled the fallout. Not the spill, the aftermath. A man in a flannel coat stood near the middle of the carriage and cleared his throat. "I saw the whole thing. That boy didn't push anyone. He didn't even raise his voice. That man," he pointed to Marcus, "he spilled the tea, then acted like it was an inconvenience to him." Conductor Ven turned, noting the interjection with measured neutrality. "Sir, I'll take all witness accounts at North Vale." The flannel man nodded. "Sure, but don't pretend we didn't see it." Marcus's jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he hissed. Ethan remained still, watching every reaction, every flicker of shifting loyalty among the crowd. It wasn't control he sought, but clarity. He had crossed a line, yes, but in doing so he had revealed what lay just beneath Marcus's polished surface. The train began to slow, brakes sighing through the undercarriage. Northvale Station approached, its platform lights cutting through the window panes like searchlights. The tension in the cabin tightened, everyone bracing for what came next. Nolan rolled the cart to the side. "They'll take statements," he said softly to Ethan, eyes still unsure. "You'll be okay. I think you did what anyone decent would have done." Ethan gave a single nod, eyes scanning for Ven, who now spoke low into his radio again. Marcus paced near the door, muttering, still hoping that forceful repetition might rewrite perception. Outside, the platform rolled closer. Uniformed figures stood waiting. Station security. No weapons drawn, no cuffs prepared. Just eyes, pens, radios. But that, Ethan knew, was enough. This was not just a spill anymore. This was a tribunal carried by whispers, cameras, and a baby's cry. Ethan took one last look around the cabin. Many passengers looked away. A few gave him nods. One older man pressed a hand to his chest as if in silent acknowledgement. Another man, further down, mouthed the words, "Well done." Then the train exhaled, slowed, and the doors slid open. Marcus stepped out first, shoulders tense as if he were marching into court. Nolan followed next, cart abandoned, face pale but jaw set. Ethan came last, carrying Leo close, wrapped in warmth and silence. The cold air outside met the heat of the confrontation still clinging to them. As they stepped onto the hard tile of the platform, the future of every man involved felt uncertain and heavy with consequence. A single choice can change who is believed when the doors finally open. The moment the security officers stepped onto the train, tension sharpened like a blade. Without a word, they gestured for Ethan, Marcus, and Nolan to follow. The baby, Leo, remained wrapped tightly against Ethan's chest, breathing softly, unaware of the weight dragging the night down. Harsh white platform lights cast long shadows as they stepped off the train. The metallic groan of the doors closing behind them felt like a verdict. The train pulled away with a low roar, a steel leviathan leaving behind three figures suspended in a moment that refused to pass. Inside the station's administrative office, the walls were painted a dull gray that matched the mood. Everything smelled of sterilized air and cold coffee. Supervisor Orlan Keefe stood behind a steel desk, a man in his late 50s with a sunken mouth and the posture of someone who no longer believed in excuses. His sharp eyes flicked from face to face, giving no one the benefit of doubt. "State your version, one at a time," he said, voice low, professional, and entirely unsympathetic. Marcus Hale wasted no time. His tone was smooth, almost polished, and he spoke with the ease of someone used to being believed. "I was seated in my assigned spot when the train jolted. The tea spilled. An unfortunate accident. But what happened next?" He turned slightly, nodding toward Ethan with restrained disdain. "Was unacceptable. He assaulted me. With intent. I want a full report logged, and consequences." Ethan stood quietly, eyes steady but guarded. His left arm held Leo protectively, and his right hand reached slowly into his coat. "I recorded what happened," he said, "after the spill. After he said my baby shouldn't be on public transport. I didn't plan to use it, but I need the truth to be heard." Orlan narrowed his gaze. "Recordings can complicate things. People only record when they don't trust the system." Ethan didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, I had no choice." Silence followed, then a slow nod. "Play it." Ethan placed his phone on the desk and tapped the screen. The audio crackled at first, then cleared. Nolan's voice played first, distant but clear. "Careful, sir, that tea's still very hot." A brief moment of silence, followed by the unmistakable clink of a teacup being set down. then the baby's faint whimper, and then Marcus. Some people really think a train is a nursery. They should stay home if they can't control their noise. Another pause. Then the baby's cry rising sharply, followed by the sounds of Ethan soothing him. Finally, Marcus again. If I wanted to babysit, I'd have children of my own. Honestly, this is public space. The recording ended, but its weight lingered. Orlan crossed his arms. And the incident with the tray? I touched his hand to the tray, Ethan admitted, to show him what not that hot actually felt like. I let go immediately. No injury. Marcus snorted. That's still assault. You can't just go around burning people. Orlan raised a brow. And yet, here we are with a baby who had boiling tea spilled on his blanket. Not by me, Marcus snapped. I didn't tell the train to jolt. You didn't hold the cup steady either, Ethan replied quietly. And you didn't check the baby. You didn't even ask if he was okay. Nolan stepped forward then, voice trembling but firm. I warned him. I saw the spill. I saw him shift right before it tipped. Orlan looked at Nolan long and hard. Why didn't you say that before? I was afraid, Nolan said. He speaks like someone used to getting people in trouble. I'm just staff. Something shifted in the room. A balance reweighed. Marcus's smug posture tightened. Ethan watched it happen, not the collapse, but the slow disintegration of authority cloaked in confidence. It wasn't over, but it had cracked. Supervisor, Marcus said, his voice colder now. Surely you understand the bigger issue. He acted out physically. I want that recorded. I'm recording everything, Orlan replied dryly. And, from where I'm standing, your complaint seems very selective. Marcus stepped back, lips pressed into a tight line. Orlan rubbed his temple. Let me make something clear. Both of you may face consequences. There are procedures. Ethan, recording someone without consent is still a violation of policy, but context matters. And right now, that context is not leaning in your favor, Mr. Hale. Ethan gave a small nod. I accept that. I only care about my brother's safety. The baby stirred slightly, and Ethan gently rocked him again, instinctively shielding him from the growing storm outside the walls. Orlan exhaled and glanced at the clock. The train's gone. You'll be here for a while. Paperwork, initial filings, maybe more depending on what legal wants. Marcus scoffed. This is ridiculous. No, Orlan said, locking eyes with him. What's ridiculous is ignoring a crying child and pretending your actions didn't matter. Now sit down. The room dimmed slightly as clouds covered the platform's floodlights outside. A low rumble of a distant train echoed somewhere beyond the station's walls, indifferent to the fates of those left behind. Ethan said nothing more. His hand rested lightly on the carrier's side, fingers curled just enough to feel the soft fabric warming again. Marcus sat, jaw tight, breath shallow, but his confidence no longer filled the space. And through the cracked door behind them, the sounds of the outside world returned slowly. Faint announcements, a distant whistle, rain starting to tick against the windows. Outside, the train had already disappeared into the dark horizon. The silence left in its wake felt irreversible. When evidence speaks, even confident lies begin to stutter. The door opened with a hiss, and the medical attendant stepped in, clipboard in hand and eyes scanning the scene with efficient calm. He was tall, older, and moved with the quiet detachment of someone used to emergencies. His name tag read Rennick Voss. He knelt beside the carrier without asking any questions yet, his gaze shifting between Ethan's tense face and the baby bundled in damp fabric. Ethan gently lifted the outer blanket, his fingers trembling slightly. No visible burns, Rennick murmured after a minute, then repeated it louder for the room to hear. No skin damage. This was a close call, but no injury. He stood up and met Orlan's eyes. Mark it. Near injury. Not a clean incident, but no trauma to the child. The phrase near injury seemed to hang in the air longer than expected. It was more than a formality. It carried weight, especially in a station report. A near injury involving an infant was a red flag, not just a note. Ethan felt some relief, but not peace. Across the room, Marcus Hale's shoulders stiffened as if he'd felt the word cut into his authority. He looked up, waiting for someone to defend him, to reset the narrative. But no one did. Supervisor Orlan Keefe, still standing behind the desk with his arms crossed, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, I'll need to go over your statement again, specifically your remarks after the spill." Marcus blinked. "What remarks?" "You said something about babies not belonging in public transport spaces," Orlan replied, his tone neutral but deliberate. "We have that from more than one person, including our staff." Marcus straightened his tie, visibly unnerved now. I was under pressure. The spill startled me. Perhaps I misspoke. "And the part where you called the baby a nuisance and questioned the boy's parental authority," Orlan pressed. "That was misunderstood," Marcus said, forced calm coating every syllable. "I was referring to the noise, not the child himself." Ethan remained silent, watching the exchange closely. The irony was almost too loud to ignore. A man who had shown no empathy now wanted to be understood. The same man who treated inconvenience like a crime now pleaded context for his own words. Ethan's jaw tensed, but he didn't interrupt. Let Marcus speak. Let the words bury themselves. Nolan Pierce, still lingering near the wall, finally stepped forward. "Sir," he said quietly, addressing Orlan, I felt pressured when I served him the tea. He had a certain way of talking, like someone important. I rushed because I didn't want to upset him." Orlan turned. "You weren't under direct orders. Why didn't you speak up earlier?" "I didn't know how this would go," Nolan admitted. "I do now." There was silence. Not awkward, but heavy. A reckoning kind of silence. Ethan glanced at Nolan, appreciating the courage it took to speak truth when the system usually rewarded silence. He could feel the tide turning, not in a dramatic courtroom reversal, but in the slow, grinding shift of power from title to truth. Marcus rubbed his temple, clearly calculating. "This feels like an ambush," he muttered. "Everyone suddenly has something to say. Everyone but me." "You've said plenty," Orlan replied, not cruelly but without sympathy. He leaned over the desk, pulling up the official incident form on his console. "You'll receive a copy of the incident report. The company will decide if further action is required. But for now, the complaint you filed earlier is no longer our primary concern." Marcus didn't reply. His silence was no longer strategic. It was the kind that came from realizing control had slipped quietly out of reach. Ethan took a deep breath, finally stepping forward with his signed statement. The pen in his hand was cheap and slightly dry, dragging uneven ink across the page, but his handwriting didn't shake. He'd waited through judgment, through doubt, through Marcus's well-tailored dominance. And now the facts were being given shape in the only place they truly mattered, the record. As he passed the form to Orlan, Ethan spoke. "Will this delay affect our transport connection?" Orlan glanced at the wall clock. "There's a good chance. I can make a call, but you may have to wait for the next route north. I know it's not ideal." Ethan nodded. He was used to plans breaking down. But this delay wasn't just about trains anymore. It was about principle. Every minute lost was one step further from their destination, but also one step closer to something that might help someone else. Marcus sat down heavily in a metal chair near the side wall, suddenly older, less defined by his sharp suit and more by the weight of what wasn't said. His complaint had turned into an inquiry, his confidence into restlessness. The room didn't judge him with loud words, but with glances, small silences, and the kind of professional neutrality that knew how to let shame do its quiet work. Ethan stepped back to the carrier, adjusting Leo's clothes and gently covering the baby's chest with a clean layer. The infant stirred but didn't wake, his breath soft and even. Ethan bent low and whispered, "Almost done, buddy. Just hold on a little longer." Nolan stood beside him, not saying anything at first. Then, quietly, "Thanks for not backing down. A lot of us never know when to speak." Ethan looked up. "Maybe we all get one moment that tells us when." Orlan began filing the documents into a physical folder, a rare formality that gave the scene a strange finality. He tapped the desk lightly, signaling the close of discussion for now. The baby gave a faint sigh in his sleep, as if reminding them that he had been the center of it all, even without words. Ethan lifted the carrier strap onto his shoulder, fatigue making his limbs ache, but clarity keeping his spine straight. Marcus didn't look at him as he passed. And as Ethan stepped into the hallway, the last line of the report still echoing in his mind, he understood something deeper. This wasn't about winning. It was about not letting the truth slip away. Reputation can fracture quietly, long before it breaks aloud. The passenger smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every second, every witness, and every reaction had already been anticipated by the teen who would defend the innocent. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The door clicked shut behind Ethan with a hollow echo, sealing out the noise of the station platform. Inside the restroom offered to them, the overhead light buzzed dimly, casting a pale glow on the chipped walls and vinyl flooring. Ethan sat heavily on the edge of the small cot beside Leo's carrier, every movement slow with weight, not exhaustion alone, but a heaviness that came from restraint held too long. The baby, miraculously calm now, lay bundled in Ethan's spare hoodie, his cheeks flushed from earlier cries. The scorched blanket sat folded in the corner, a silent reminder of the moment everything had shifted. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the floor as questions ran circles in his mind. Could he have stopped it sooner? Should he have stayed silent? What would have happened if the tea had landed a few inches closer? The door creaked open. Orlan Keefe entered without knocking, his official posture softened now in the absence of others. "Just came to let you know," he said, his voice lower, almost reluctant. "Reports are nearly finalized. Shouldn't be much longer." Ethan nodded, but didn't look up. Orlan hesitated. Then, almost casually, he stepped further inside and closed the door behind him. "You know," he said slowly, "this isn't the first time we've had issues with Marcus Hale." That made Ethan raise his head. "He's smart," Orlan continued, resting one hand against the wall. "Knows how to dance just close enough to the edge that nothing sticks. He's filed 3 formal complaints in the last year. Always finds a way to flip things around, make himself the victim. Staff often walk away with warnings, but tonight was different." "How so?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with curiosity but not hope. "You're the first one who didn't flinch when the narrative shifted. You stayed still, but you didn't stay quiet. That recording, it changed the air in the room." Ethan looked over at Leo. "I wasn't trying to change anything," he said. "Just trying to protect my brother." Orlan nodded, then added, "That might have been exactly what did change it." There was a long pause. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, filling the silence with an uneasy hum. Orlan seemed to weigh his next words. "He'll try to bounce back, Marcus. He always does. But this time, people saw something, heard something. He'll feel it, even if it's not in the form of handcuffs." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't sure if that counted as justice or just delay. Orlan pushed off from the wall. "Get some rest. You've done more than most grown men would have." The door closed gently behind him. Ethan sat motionless for a long moment, then finally stood and walked over to the small window. Outside, the platform was nearly empty. But on a bench near the far edge, Marcus sat alone, his posture hunched, his sharp suit now rumpled and ill-fitting in the chill air. No phone in hand, no one beside him, just a man with nothing left to explain now that everyone had heard what mattered. The sight was strange. Not satisfying exactly, but sobering. The man who'd looked through Ethan as if he didn't belong now sat unseen by everyone else. A soft knock broke the quiet. Ethan turned. Nolan stood in the doorway holding something wrapped in plastic. "I brought you a clean baby blanket from Lost and Found," he said, offering it like an apology. "It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Ethan stepped forward and took it with a grateful nod. Nolan didn't leave right away. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the stained blanket in the corner, then on the sleeping infant. "I just wanted to say," Nolan murmured, "what you did back there. That wasn't just brave. It was needed." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I didn't feel brave." "That's exactly why it worked," Nolan said with a faint smile. "Because you weren't doing it for show." They stood there in shared silence, two boys caught in the wake of something bigger than either had planned for. Then Nolan gave a respectful nod and slipped away into the corridor. Ethan tucked the new blanket around Leo with slow, careful hands. The baby didn't stir. A trace of a smile appeared on Ethan's lips, worn but sincere. He sat back down on the cot and allowed himself to breathe deeply, letting the pressure of the past hours settle. He wasn't sure what would come next. Maybe letters, maybe hearings, maybe nothing. But he knew now that silence wasn't always the safest choice, and that restraint could sometimes speak louder than confrontation. Outside the window, the first hints of dawn began to soften the sky's edge, pale blue bleeding into black. And in that fading darkness, Ethan realized something profound. He was no longer simply carrying responsibility, he was becoming it. Growth often arrives disguised as a moment you never wanted. The moment the platform announcement echoed through the static-choked speakers, "Clearance approved, passenger Morell," Ethan didn't move right away. His arms tightened slightly around the carrier as if confirming to himself that Leo was safe. Asleep again, bundled in a fresh wrap. The night's chaos had drained most of the adrenaline from his limbs, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the waiting area beneath the harsh industrial lighting of Northvale Station. He could still feel the burn of tension sitting on his shoulders, a weight not yet lifted. Across the polished floor, Marcus Hale stood near a cold metal bench, arms folded, posture defensive. His leather gloves were back on, fingers tapping against his sleeve with forced patience. The calm he projected was artificial, too rigid, too rehearsed. He didn't glance at Ethan, but the stiffness in his neck suggested he could feel the younger boy's gaze. The supervisor had instructed him to wait for an internal review board's call. No formal charge, no police, just an administrative delay. And yet, the verdict felt damning. Marcus had been left behind. Ethan walked past him without a word. For a second, their eyes locked, not as opponents, but as two people who had seen each other clearly now. No insults, no apologies, just the silence of consequences. Ethan's gaze held no victory, only fatigue and a quiet understanding that some things, once broken, don't shatter. They simply stop working the same way. "Track 4, boarding in 3 minutes, came the distant voice over the loudspeaker. Ethan approached the platform, flashing the travel clearance Orlan Keefe had hastily signed. A uniformed guard waved him through with a nod, recognizing him from the incident report. No one questioned the baby now. No one commented on noise or space or propriety. The night had earned them that much. Inside the train, Ethan found a seat near the window, the farthest corner of the car. He slid into it with care, positioning Leo's carrier between his legs and the seat in front. The child stirred slightly, his lips parting for a soft sigh before sinking back into sleep. Ethan reached into his bag and retrieved the faded blue blanket. the one with the faint tea stain at the edge and the slightly scorched corner near the hem. He didn't replace it over Leo but held it in his hands, feeling the rough patch where the fibers had stiffened. He could still hear Marcus's voice. Some people just don't belong in these spaces. The words, arrogant and sterile, rang in his ears not with pain, but with context. They weren't about Leo. They weren't even about the tea. They were about power, who was allowed to make others feel unwelcome and who was expected to endure it quietly. Ethan looked out the window. Dawn had begun to break, only faintly, a gray smudge crawling over the hills, but enough to see the outline of tracks leading into the fog. He didn't know what would come next. There were still connections to catch, a house to reach, an aunt who was probably pacing by her phone, unaware of the last 12 hours. But for now, he allowed himself this moment. His fingers brushed Leo's small fist, and the baby curled tighter in response. Footsteps approached. It was the new conductor, different from Ven, an older man with a bent back and a soft way of moving. He nodded to Ethan politely, checked the ticket stub, then paused. "You all right, son?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, just tired." The conductor glanced at the baby and gave a small smile. "Looks like he's got a good big brother." Ethan didn't respond. Words felt too heavy. The conductor moved on, and the door clicked shut behind him. As the train lurched forward, Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The vibration underfoot was familiar, but it no longer hummed with anxiety. It was motion, progress. The train was moving on, and so was he. He didn't replay the confrontation anymore. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, not shouted, not performed, but recorded and witnessed. His silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation. And now, it was over. Not in the way dramatic endings play out in stories, no justice delivered by spotlight, no apologies from enemies, but in the quiet way reality moves. One station at a time, one step beyond what hurt, toward whatever comes next. Ethan opened his eyes again and watched the world blur by in streaks of gray and green. The reflection in the window showed a boy who looked older than the one who boarded the Silver Meridian the night before. He didn't feel angry. He felt certain. Somewhere behind them, Marcus Hale remained seated on a bench, waiting for a process he could no longer control. Somewhere ahead, Ethan's aunt would open the door, and Leo would laugh without remembering any of this. And in between, a boy on a train learned how to walk through fire and come out carrying someone else in his arms. Some lessons follow you forward, long after the train is gone. The email came quietly, with no fanfare, no bold headline, just a subject line that read, "Review Board Decision, regarding incident on Silver Meridian, final summary." Ethan Morrell sat at the small kitchen table in his aunt's home, Leo asleep in a basket beside him. The boy's soft breaths were the only sound in the room. Ethan's hands hovered over the mouse, hesitating, as if opening the message might somehow make the past 2 weeks real again. Finally, he clicked. The words unfolded with clinical precision. Based on testimony, audio evidence, and statements provided by all parties involved in the March 22 incident aboard Train 1147, Silver Meridian, the Passenger Conduct Review Board concludes that Mr. Marcus Hale was the route instigator. While Mr. Ethan Morrell's response was deemed unorthodox, it does not constitute aggression under our travel safety policy. Ethan read the lines twice, then again. The document outlined everything: the recorded conversation, Nolan's support, and the board's internal ruling that Marcus would be banned from traveling on that rail line for 12 months due to a repeated pattern of hostile conduct, particularly toward minors and staff. It ended with an unexpected sentence that struck Ethan harder than the rest. "Thank you for remaining composed in a situation where others might not have." He leaned back, exhaling deeply. For a moment, he did nothing. No smile, no visible relief. Just stillness. Then, almost mechanically, he clicked print. The printer hummed quietly in the corner. Ethan folded the page carefully, slid it into a folder he had kept since the incident, along with his handwritten notes and a spare copy of the audio file on a flash drive. He didn't feel victorious, just steady. Footsteps approached behind him. "You okay?" his uncle's voice asked. Mason, his aunt's husband, stood in the doorway wiping his hands with a dish towel. "Yeah," Ethan replied, sliding the folder into his backpack. "Just got the board's decision." Mason glanced down at Leo, then at Ethan. "Good news?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, they banned him. A year." "That's something." "Yeah." Later that night, after dinner and a quiet walk with Leo in the backyard, Ethan opened his school notebook. It was late, the house asleep except for him. On the first blank page he wrote the date, then a title, "What the Tray Table Taught Me." He didn't plan it as an assignment. He just wrote about the tea, the silence, the decision not to yell but to act in a way that would be remembered without regret, about how no one had expected much from him, just a quiet teen on a crowded train with a baby and a too small voice. He wrote about the look on Marcus's face, not during the spill, but when the recording was played. That flicker of recognition that truth, once heard aloud, could not be unwound. He wrote about Nolan shaking his head afterward, the weight in his voice when he'd said, "I should have said something sooner." The words came easily, and when he finished, he didn't reread them. He just tore out the page, smoothed it flat, and slid it into his binder for school the next day. The essay landed on his teacher's desk 2 days later, slipped in quietly at the end of a pile. Mr. Corvin, a tall, methodical man who rarely smiled in class, paused when he reached Ethan's paper. He read it once, then again, then once more. The next morning, when Ethan walked in, Mr. Corvin didn't say anything. He simply placed the essay face down on Ethan's desk with one note in small, careful handwriting. Brutally clear, deeply human. Ethan didn't react right away, but inside something shifted. Not pride exactly, but recognition. For the first time, he felt seen, not for what he had done, but for what he had carried. A week passed. Ethan noticed something strange in the halls. Classmates who had never spoken to him before started nodding in quiet acknowledgement. One boy from chemistry, Thomas, asked if he was the one from that article. Ethan hadn't known there was an article. He found it later that night. A parenting blog had posted a piece titled, "Teen Shields Infant from Hot Tea Incident on Train. Composure Over Chaos." Nolan had anonymously shared his version, careful not to name anyone. But the story was unmistakable. The blog described a teenage boy who stood his ground not with shouting, but with presence, with a single, deliberate action that turned the narrative and revealed what dignity under pressure could look like. Ethan read the article once, just once. Then he shut his laptop. He didn't forward it to anyone. He didn't repost it or check the comments. He had nothing to prove. He only told his aunt, who hugged Leo tighter than usual that night, whispering something to the baby that Ethan couldn't quite hear. That evening, as Ethan stood by the window watching the sun lower behind the distant trees, he noticed something quiet inside himself. Not peace, not entirely, but something sturdier than before. Something earned. Leo giggled from the couch as Mason made silly faces at him. Ethan turned, smiled faintly, then looked back out the window. He didn't know what came next, but he knew how to carry what had already happened. The scars were small, but they spoke. Sometimes the strength people admire most is the one that didn't look loud at the time. Teen Shields Infant from Hot Tea Incident on Train. Composure Over Chaos. Ethan Morrell read the title once, then again, and only then did he realize what it was about. No names were used, just descriptions. A 16-year-old, a baby, a crowded train, a well-dressed man, and a cup of tea that spilled when it shouldn't have. The blog post painted the event like a parable, one of quiet bravery and restraint, of a teenager who stood his ground in the face of injustice without throwing a single punch. Nolan Pierce's words, though shared anonymously, echoed throughout the piece in quoted blocks. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he just acted when no one else would, and that moment changed something in me. Ethan stared at the screen, his eyes unmoving. The comment section was already filling up. Dozens of voices chimed in, some skeptical, some stunned, others deeply moved. This sounds like fiction. What 16-year-old reacts like that? If it's real, then that kid's got more courage than most grown men. Respect to whoever that teen is, whoever raised him, too. He closed the tab, slowly, not out of embarrassment, but because the praise wasn't why he'd done it. Leo had needed him. That was enough. It had always been enough. But recognition, whether sought or not, had a way of traveling. 2 days after the post went live, Nolan approached him at the station cafe where they were briefly meeting to sign remaining witness documents. He looked different, not in appearance but in posture. Taller somehow, shoulders pulled back, less of the nervous fidgeting Ethan had remembered on the train. "I told them I didn't want my name on the blog," Nolan said quickly, almost apologetically, "but I needed people to understand why it mattered." Ethan nodded slowly, his tone measured. "You told the truth. That matters more than how people react." Nolan smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet, his job application form for the station's full-time operations desk. A pen mark circled a single entry. Significant personal learning moment. Incident on Silver Meridian. "I put it in here," Nolan said, "because of you. I think I finally understand what standing up looks like, even when your voice shakes." Ethan didn't say much in response, but he felt it settle somewhere deep, an invisible shift. He had defended Leo, yes, but in doing so he'd shown others what defense without chaos could look like. Outside, rain tapped against the window pane of the small station cafe. The world hadn't changed. People still bustled, announcements still droned, and trains still ran late. But for those who'd been on that particular night train, something had shifted permanently. The incident, once a flash of tension and spilled tea, now lived on as something more. Later that week, Ethan received an anonymous envelope slipped into the station's outgoing mail slot. No return address. Just a single note inside, typed on clean cardstock. Sometimes the world doesn't need a hero, just someone who remembers what matters when everything else forgets. There was no signature, but Ethan didn't need one. At school, the shift was more subtle but no less real. Classmates who had only seen him as the quiet one in the back row began offering nods in the hallway. His English teacher, Mr. Holland, pulled him aside after an essay submission. "Your piece on the train, steel tracks and blue blankets, was one of the clearest things I've ever read from a student your age," Mr. Holland said. "Not just well-written, lived in. It hit hard." Ethan shrugged, trying to downplay it, but his voice was softer than usual. "It just happened. I didn't want it to." "That's the thing about stories," the teacher replied. "The best ones aren't planned. They're endured." Back at home, Ethan kept the article to himself. He didn't want his aunt fussing, and Leo wouldn't understand it yet. But he did save the link. Quietly. In case one day his brother asked about the old blue blanket with the faded stain that never quite washed out. He'd tell him, not about the fame, not about the comments or blog posts, but about what it meant to stay calm when you had every reason not to, about why silence can be powerful when paired with purpose, and about how that night, on a train rolling through darkness, he'd learned that defense wasn't always about pushing back. Sometimes it was about holding ground with both hands wrapped around something fragile, and even though Ethan never said it aloud, he knew the truth of it better than any article could say. What begins as defense can echo as an example. Marcus Hale's appeal was denied in under 5 minutes. The formal letter from the Rail Passenger Conduct Review Board, marked confidential but already circling internally, cited a pattern of verbal hostility toward miners and service staff. The language was sharp, unusually direct. A line in the internal memo that followed made Ethan reread it twice. Mr. Hale's previously unchallenged record was effectively pierced by corroborated evidence, an audio file that has now become internal precedent. That audio file. Ethan hadn't expected it to echo so far. He sat on the narrow park bench outside the district library, a light wind brushing the leaves above his head, watching Leo waddle unsteadily toward a flock of pigeons. The boy giggled, oblivious to everything his older brother had endured. In one hand, Ethan held a printed copy of the board's decision, its black ink smudged from his thumb. In the other, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Nolan. "You changed more than you realize." Just those 6 words, but Ethan felt their weight settle like a hand on his shoulder. He looked up from the screen slowly, eyes trailing across the open lawn as if expecting some physical sign of change. But there were only trees, birds, distant traffic, and Leo, shrieking with joy as the birds scattered. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to that night. The hot tea, the hiss of soaked fabric, Marcus's scoffing voice, the tightening in his chest when no one seemed to care, the silent vow he made, not for revenge, but for truth. And now, here it was, truth archived. Inside the review board's report, another clause stood out. A quiet reform, tucked at the end under policy adjustments. Effective immediately. All hot beverages on long-haul night routes must be served in spill-safe containers while in motion. Exception granted only when train is at a full stop. It was small, barely a paragraph. But to Ethan, it felt larger than Marcus Hale's ban. He didn't want applause. He didn't want headlines. But he did want this. For no other baby to scream in shock from a careless spill. For no other teen to be told they were the disruption. For quiet to mean safety, not silence. As Leo stumbled and fell onto the grass with a laugh, Ethan stood and walked over, brushing dirt from the baby's tiny hands. The child looked up at him with wide eyes, trusting completely. Ethan crouched beside him, the letter still folded in his back pocket, and whispered, "You're safe now. That's all that matters." Later that day, as they returned home, Ethan noticed an envelope tucked inside the apartment mailbox. It bore the rail company's seal and a handwritten line in blue ink, "For Mr. Morrell." Inside was a copy of the revised passenger conduct guidelines. No cover letter, no signature, just a highlight over the beverage clause and one underlined sentence. Recorded evidence from recent passenger disputes served as reference for policy update. He didn't know whether to smile or cry. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, Leo in a high chair beside him, and began to write in his journal. Not for school this time. Not for anyone else. Just for himself. Restraint is not weakness. It is preparation. It is strategy. It is choosing not to strike when the world gives you the chance, because you'd rather build something that lasts. And sometimes, he thought, the most powerful thing you can do is leave proof. The next day, they walked together through the local park. The sun was low and golden, casting long shadows over the path. Leo pointed at birds, at clouds, at his own feet as if every step was a marvel. Ethan held his brother's hand, letting the silence stretch between them, not heavy, but peaceful. The world would always hold its share of danger, of men like Marcus Hale, of moments that burn and stain. But they didn't always win. Not when someone, just one person, chose to push back with calm, with courage, with clarity, and not when that push left behind something undeniable. Some battles are won not by force, but by leaving proof behind. The story began not with celebration, but with a memory wrapped in a faintly scarred blue blanket and sealed with silence that only Ethan Morrell truly understood. He sat on the floor of their modest living room, knees bent, back straight, the late afternoon sun streaking across the wood panels in thin golden lines. Leo, now toddling and curious, sat in front of him in a wide circle of toy blocks and crumpled birthday paper. A single candle flickered on a soft cupcake nearby, forgotten for the moment. In Ethan's hands rested the old baby blanket, the one that once carried more fear than warmth. He held it up slowly, as if handling something sacred. "You don't remember this," Ethan said softly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of unspoken memory. Leo's chubby hands reached toward the blanket, fingers curling in exploration, but Ethan gently pulled it just out of reach. "Not yet." "There was a night," he began, "when this cloth nearly became something else." Leo blinked, chewing absently on a block shaped like a train car. Ethan's eyes wandered for a moment, locking onto nothing. His voice dropped into a steadier rhythm, more for himself now than for the boy. "We were on a train. It was cold. You were asleep, tiny, bundled like a secret. I sat in a seat no one wanted, tucked against the window with the night crawling outside. I thought if I could just stay still, keep you warm, and not bother anyone, we'd get through it. Quietly." His fingers traced the faint stain on the edge of the blanket, the part forever marked by scalding tea and the sting of a stranger's contempt. He didn't mention Marcus Hale by name. Not yet. There was a man who didn't like that you existed in his world. Not because you did anything, just because you were small, and you made a sound. Ethan's voice became quieter, but his jaw tightened. He poured tea that wasn't meant for drinking. Maybe it was an accident, maybe not, but it hit this very spot. He tapped the mark lightly. "Right here." Leo reached for it again. This time, Ethan let him touch it. "You cried," he whispered, smiling faintly at the boy's confused gaze. "And that cry did something I didn't expect. It made everything around us real, loud, dangerous. And that's when I knew I couldn't just sit there anymore." For a moment, the air was thick with memory. Ethan's breath hitched slightly, but he kept going, because the words mattered now more than ever. "I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I showed him what heat felt like. Briefly. Just enough." And for the first time that night, the carriage went quiet, not because I asked it to, but because truth forced its way in. He paused, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Outside, a dog barked once. A car engine rolled past the window. But in the room, it was still. Ethan reached over and picked up the storybook they never opened that day, resting it on the couch beside him. He didn't need it. His story had no dragons or magic, but it had a choice, a confrontation, a near miss, a young boy trying to carry a baby through a world not made for either of them. Leo crawled closer, laying his head against Ethan's leg, unaware of the meaning behind every word but sensing the calm in his brother's voice. Ethan smiled faintly and rested a hand on the baby's soft hair. "They didn't believe me at first. That's something you'll learn. Truth takes longer to arrive than lies. But when it does, it doesn't leave. It stays. Sometimes it leaves a mark. Sometimes it changes people." The boy stirred but didn't lift his head. Ethan looked down at him, the corners of his mouth curving into a proud, weary expression. "There's something I want you to remember, even if it takes years before it makes sense." He picked up the blanket and gently draped it across Leo's back like a small cape. The scarred edge rested against the boy's shoulder, and Ethan watched the blue fabric settle into stillness. "Dignity," Ethan said, "isn't something anyone hands you. It's something you protect, especially when it feels like the world is trying to take it away. People might try to silence you, mock you, or pretend you're too small to matter. But truth, once spoken clearly and with purpose." He paused, letting the final words fall like steady rain over quiet ground. "Can survive even steel tracks and burned fabric." Leo shifted slightly, letting out a soft coo of contentment. The room, though quiet, pulsed with the kind of silence that holds meaning rather than absence. Ethan leaned down, placing a gentle kiss on his brother's head, the warmth grounding him. The memory of that night no longer carried only fear. It carried fire, proof, and a lesson told not in rage, but in resolve. He could see it now. The day Leo would be older, curious, perhaps confused. The questions would come, and when they did, Ethan would be ready. He would hand him the same faded cloth and say, "This was your first battle, and we both made it out stronger." Seconds later, the teen's retaliation left the passenger stunned, the blanket safe, and the cabin frozen in shock. Accountability had been enforced instantly. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and fearless force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores negligence, disrespect, and standing up against wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on accountability, integrity, and protecting the vulnerable.